We have a great amount of people who've already joined, so I'm going to get us kicked off. Welcome to the first StartOut event of 2022. I'm so excited to have you all here. I'm excited to be welcoming these guests, as well as providing the space for the conversation around diversity beyond recruiting and building your holistic DEI strategy. As a reminder, StartOut is a US-based nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2009, and we focus on supporting LGBTQ entrepreneurs and startup founders. Our mission is to increase the number, diversity, and impact of LGBTQ entrepreneurs, and also to amplify their stories to ultimately drive the economic empowerment of our LGBTQ community. Over the past 10 plus years, we've built a community of over 18,000 members, and we support over 300 entrepreneurs every year. So in essence, we're all about networking, we're all about entrepreneurship, we're about community. If you're a founder, we provide a lot of direct individual support through our community events, through one-on-one mentorship, through an accelerator program, and you can take a look and see a little bit more about how we reach our members and what we do to support them throughout the year. All of these events wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, for which we are incredibly grateful. But in particular, I really want to call out the sponsor for this specific event. Comcast NBCUniversal LIFT Labs, which is powered by Techstars, supports startups at all stages and is often partners with organizations like StartOut. They're connecting founders all across the globe. Their team is the entry point for founders who want to learn from and work with experts from the Comcast NBCUniversal space, as well as their network of partners and brands. Their programs like the LIFT Labs Accelerator, which is powered by Techstars, help the companies grow, and projects like the recent docuseries that they did, Founders in Color, to amplify startup voices far and wide. We are so appreciative of this team. Please visit them at the link here, and we'll also tell you a little bit more about what they're doing at the end of our event. But without further ado, without waxing too poetic for everyone out there, I would love to introduce you to our incredible panel of speakers, but first and foremost by kicking it over to Brad, who is our moderator for today. Please, as we are going along, ask some questions. Use the Q&A feature that you can see here on the bar at the bottom of your screen. Use the chat feature to chat with the audience. Know that if you have any questions that come up, we'll try to direct you over to the Q&A, but we'll also be there answering your questions as we go along. Thank you everybody for joining. Without further ado, take it away, Brad.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma, and a big thank you again to all of the hard work that the StartOut HQ does. And again, I'm going to say a big thank you to Comcast NBCUniversal LIFT Labs, powered by Techstars, for sponsoring today's event. And most importantly, thank you to our fabulous panelists here that we have today. Such diversity, such great perspectives, and from different industries. As Emma mentioned, I'm Brad Dressler. I am on the programming board for StartOut. This is my 5th year. So obviously I love being involved with this organization. I hope you all will love attending future events and maybe getting involved somehow with StartOut in the future yourself. My background is in education and marketing in the tech space. Worked at large corporations, I've worked at startups, so and nonprofits too. So I've seen a wide variety of different aspects of business and how people approach diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's why I wanted to organize this today. This event is important to me. I'm very passionate about it as a queer man, but also I really want to see there be more discussions about strategy across the board in different aspects of businesses, and not just the recruiting and retention are extremely important for sure, but we want to be thinking holistically about DEI. So that's what today's conversation is going to be focused on. I'm going to hand it off to our panelists. I will go and hand it off to H first, and if H, you'll hand it over to somebody else, we'll go from there.
Hi, everybody. Really nice to be here. Appreciate the time to talk about these topics and sort of important questions and issues. I'm the founder and CEO of Hustle Up. We are a searchable network that connects creative talent in media and entertainment to each other and makes that talent discoverable to media and entertainment companies like NBC Comcast. We went through the NBCUniversal Comcast LIFT Labs Accelerator powered by Techstars in 2021. We just finished it about 3 months ago, and we're about to launch our invite-only beta next week, actually, here in Los Angeles. So we're working with organizations like Women in Film, Outfest, the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, NAACP, and others to make sure we have lots of diverse creative talent on our platform. Abel.
Awesome. Thank you, H. My name is Abel. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And I am currently a product owner at Marmoset, which is a music licensing and production company, and the only certified B Corp in the music industry. And I am also a community leader for Out in Tech, and specifically with the Portland chapter, as well as the QT BIPOC committee. And I will pass it to Daphne.
Thank you. So my name is Daphne LeBlanc. I am a marketer, I guess, by nature. I started my career in a really different path than probably a lot of people. And I started in nonprofit. So I started from the bottom up, and man, this is going to date me, but there was nothing called digital marketing when I started marketing. And we're going to pretend that everyone else on this panel is in the same age bracket. But I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think that it often gets stuck in just the human resource kind of recruiting arena, and it really should be a bigger spoke topic for everyone. Thanks.
Thanks for those intros, and thanks for being here. We appreciate you making the time. All these panelists, they volunteer their time and talent and their knowledge, so we really appreciate them. So let's get started. Let's jump into it. Again, as the audience is listening, if you think of questions or there's something we haven't really discussed that you would love for us to talk about, we may or may not have answers, but we can always share a perspective and some information what we have. So feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box. So let's jump into it with, this is going to be a question for all the panelists. I would like to hear from each of you, what's one area specifically that you think is kind of overlooked when it comes to DEI discussions? Like what, and for just, one area, then would you share one tip or best practice you think might be valuable to consider in that area? So like, one example for me, and I won't actually give the full answer, but if I were to say perhaps external marketing or perhaps internal communications, those kind of things. So I'll hand it back over to H to start with, and then whoever wants to jump in after that can jump in.
Thanks, Brad. Look, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this panel is trying to talk about diversity from the perspective of not just recruiting talent, but actually how to create a culture internal to your company that's meaningful to make people happy or help them have an enriched experience and also to retain them, right? And so I think I'll just, kind of give a little bit of my background. I've been out in my career since I started working. I was out in high school and college. I have seen, heard, and experienced it all. And some of it has not been the most positive of experiences. The world is changing, but I think, we can all do a lot more to change our part of it in the way that we build culture and build, the infrastructure of our companies that makes it an inclusive and diverse place. I think a lot of diverse talent, especially, feel the burden of representing an entire community. And that burden often means not necessarily being true to yourself. And that can be a very exhausting experience, right? So I think one of the things that I think is important is to create a culture where people don't feel like they have to do what's called covering oftentimes in HR parlance, right? Where people don't feel like they can, dress or behave the way they want to because it will, be earmarked as a particular stereotype, right? Or they don't want to talk about their relationships if they're gay, or their affiliations. They don't want to talk about certain topics related to their identity because they think they'll be perceived as being strident. They don't want to talk about their associations because, again, it feels like that will somehow out them in their workplace, right? And so I think one of the things that is important to the culture that we're creating at Hustle Up and other cultures that I've tried to create previously is to really create a safe space with a lot of active listening of our employees, and to not assume certain things, to really engage employees in conversations, to create resource groups or affinity groups, and encourage everybody to join them so that there's not a stigma around being part of a employee resource group, and creating really clear and safe procedures with regard to feedback and reporting, where people feel like there's a culture that allows them to talk about issues that they're having in a way that isn't penalizing, right? And the last thing I'll kind of say is I think, it's really important to encourage and kind of normalize language in the workplace that feels inclusive and feels progressive in terms of diversity, where no one person, again, feels like they have to always be the one to be speaking up or confronting stereotypes. And I think one of the really useful ways to do that that I've found is through really authentic storytelling and fostering authentic storytelling rather than labels and stereotypes, and really fostering ways to become allies to each other through our personal stories and the relationships and trust you build in the workplace when you have that open culture.
Do you mind if I jump in? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, jump in. Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. I'm right there with you, H. And I think that something that is often overlooked, it's pretty much I think it's a combo. It's the fact that DEI is a collective. So I think that one of the things that we miss out all the time is that educational component, because I find that people are so fixated on this metric. Oh, I need to have enough Asians. I need to have enough LGBTQ. I need to have enough Black. I need to have enough women. Like, why don't we actually take a step back, have this collective conversation, and maybe because they don't know how to handle it. So I think that that's one area that is really overlooked, because everyone is kind of teetering. I don't know if I should say this. Well, you don't know until you try and actually have a real authentic relationship. So I love how you said that, H, these authentic stories, because people need to hear them. People need to hear, how does it feel that, someone looks at me and they're like, hey, Daphne, what are you? You don't look whole. Huh? What does that mean? I don't look whole. Well, I don't know if you're this or if you're that. And now your hair looks like this. So I'm not sure. I'm like, but at the same token, I feel like, you know what? You were brave enough to take me to the side and have that conversation. So I think it's twofold, education and understanding that DEI is a collective.
Yeah, I would definitely +1 to the authentic stories and letting people use their own voices. And I think like another area that often gets overlooked is applying DEI to departments outside of people ops or HR. And for example, my background is more technical, and a lot of times folks completely overlook applying DEI within a tech team. And same goes for like marketing team, business teams, every other team within an organization should also be involved with DEI initiatives, and that needs to be as collaborative an effort as possible. I know at Marmoset we have a diversity team, ERG, an employee resource group, and while we do have like our own meetings as a team, we frequently collaborate with all of the other teams across the organization on how can these other teams help us meet our DEI goals. And so, yeah, I think branching outside of just keeping DEI in the HR space is another important area.
Yeah, all great points, and I +1 to everything all of you said. I think, yeah, I was reading an article recently about how when DEI is very siloed, it's ineffective, and also even there's conversations sort of now in the space about, you know, what having a chief diversity officer is great from having a high level C-level exec, but how does that actually impact across the board? So I think it's very important to think about the hierarchy, the structure, the reporting, the impact. Like, it needs to be across all of your different primary areas. So if, you know, you're in a, like, let's say a tech space, hypothetically, you know, there needs to be thoughts about that in the product space, in the HR space, in the marketing and communication spaces, you know, all of those variables, and then some, like the customer service areas, you know, the people ops, all of those variables need to be considered from DEI perspective, and not just hiring retention, but all of the different variables that impact it, like development of products, how we market and talk about products, who we showcase in advertising and marketing and whatnot. All of those things need to be considered across the board, but there needs to be a hierarchy, and there needs to be a way to sort of make sure that's reported, right, and factored into the success as a KPI for whatever, whether it's you're a nonprofit, a startup, or a large corporation. You should have KPIs, you should have things you're measuring. And so you need to think about the structure and how is that actually measured and reported, and then how you continue to build upon that as a collective team, a company cross-wide. So all great points.
Brad, I would just jump in and add that. I think that comes back to Daphne, what you were saying, you know, not to put words in your mouth, but I think, you know, what you were saying about, like, we're all very concerned about making sure that we have, you know, enough of various diversity categories, right? That's not the only metric. That's not the only KPI. And that's really a KPI that's based on, you know, recruiting numbers. It's not based on retention and on how to keep people happy and productive and fulfilled and upskilling and all the things that are challenging around internal culture and issues around diversity and equity and inclusion. So I think that's something we all have to think about, like, how are we measuring success, right?
Totally agree. I think that, and making it a priority. So I feel like all of us are saying the same thing. It's, the priority has to be DEI. It can't just be this siloed department. It has to be across the board. And how are we defining it? How are we defining that we are successful in it? It might not be those metrics that HR is looking at. And I have a feeling that's probably a bigger issue, that it is not the metric that HR is looking at, but those numbers roll up into HR. And also, what is a company doing to actually support DEI efforts outside of HR, outside of recruiting? You know, is it something that you are truly interested in? If I were to go and look at your budget, and probably the lowest budget is in DEI, but you hired a chief diversity officer. What does that mean, right? What does that budget include? Your C-suite does not look diverse. Your interns do not look diverse. So what exactly does it mean that you hired a diversity
Even like
executive.
giving back in community days, right? A lot of
Exactly.
companies don't offer you community days to go and, work with your community and give back to your community, however you define that community, right? Or for that matter, allow you to bring your team or your coworkers with you into your community to give back and to do that work. We were looking at a lot of studies around workplace perks because we're putting together our employment packages and are thinking a lot about, in this era of working at home, what does it mean to have a perk from a company, right? The salad days, as it were, the free lunch days are kind of over if we're not all in the same place. And so, I think one of the things that ranks really highly on a lot of studies and polls is people really like the idea that they're not just being given, paid time off to go do something, but the company's actually fostering it, encouraging it, getting behind it, engaging in it with them, right? It's not just like, oh, and we'll give you an extra day off to go do whatever you want and volunteer. It's like, no, you can actually bring that mission and that imperative into the workplace and share it with your company and your colleagues and get support for that, right? And again, that comes back to being able to authentically engage with each other, I think, and understand where we're coming from, what our priorities are, what matters to us as individuals, part of a larger organization.
Great points. I want to quick bring in a couple things that people have mentioned in the chat. One, briefly, I'm going to sort of reframe this a little bit. Somebody mentioned that, there was a mention about age and whatnot at the beginning of the conversation. And we need to be considering, ageism as well, as far as diversity, and that, different perspectives, the big picture value of DEI should be different perspectives and different backgrounds bring new ideas and in things to consider, important variables to consider when making important decisions and prioritizing things at a company. And there's all sorts of different variables in that. That could be age, that could be ethnicity, that could be socioeconomic, there's so many different variables that I think often that could be something related to disability. There's so many variables that are often left out of the equation. And I think one thing that's sort of I've seen discussed in certain articles and things recently is the idea of we really need to even go a step further and really trying to push that, like, this is such a value add to companies, and companies need to start looking at it more that way. And I know somebody sort of said something about, like, let's not look at this use in the old ways used to be, let's look at a quota, let's check the boxes, let's make sure we're being inclusive by checking boxes, right? But it needs to be much more about a value add to your organization. And so I think that's important to think about very broadly and or specifically. And then I've seen a couple people have mentioned in chat also, from a technical product perspective, there's often a lot of bias when certain groups are used for testing, or when even forming questionnaires, or surveys, when you're sending out for product testing or things like that, there can be a lot of bias in those that is not intentional. But if you had a more diverse group of people involved in that process and looking at all those considerations from different perspectives, you hopefully would catch a lot more of those things, and you would get a lot more accurate data and more fulfilling data that looks much further down the road and is much more inclusive. So I'm curious what y'all's thoughts are from a sort of a more, I know Abel's maybe the only one from specifically a technical background, but if anyone has any thoughts on that or experiences you can share from a technical perspective on where DEI came in as a variable, or should have come in perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I think as you mentioned, and as folks have mentioned in the chat, bias is, or unconscious bias more specifically, is a huge issue within the tech industry. And a lot of that does stem from the fact that engineering teams tend to be more majority white, straight, cis male makeup. And thankfully over the last decade or so, that has slowly been becoming more diverse. But but yeah, a lot of unconscious bias can go into algorithms that companies are building. I know like one famous example is like a facial recognition software that I believe Facebook was working on that misidentified Black people's faces. And yeah, so thankfully there are some incredible people out there that are fighting against AI bias in organizations. There's one called the Algorithmic Justice League, led by a brilliant MIT AI researcher. Her name is Joy. I don't want to mispronounce the last name, but I think it's Buamwini. I can post it in the chat later. But yeah, there are lots of organizations out there for like leading the charge in terms of like applying DEI work into the technical space. And yeah, and it expands beyond algorithms too. Like for designing, like UX design, there's the accessibility aspect. So designing for disabled folks, and there's also a fairly newer concept called equitable design that was started by an organization called Creative Reaction Lab. And so that's focuses on like creating design through an equity lens specifically. And so yeah, I can post all of these resources in the chat, but I'll let others speak as well.
Great. I did just post the AGL website, so people can check that out. So that's one of them. That's a great resource. Yeah, to that point, does anybody, well, first of all, Daphne or H, do y'all have any other thoughts on that related from a technical perspective or anything else we've mentioned? Do you have any other resources? I would love for our audience to sort of take away some resources. So if you have a resource you can share in whatever area of DEI might be, or a leader that maybe people might want to follow on social for various ideas and sort of a thought leader in this space, anything like that that you might want to share, or other thoughts to come to mind, please open up the floor. So Daphne or H, either one of you, take it away.
Abel, you made me think about so many different products and just the lack of diversity in their testing. It's amazing. And I never even thought about it. You just made I'm like, oh, that just sucks. Like I was thinking about, going to the airport and trying to wash my hands, right? So I'm of a lighter skin tone than my child. So like I go and I have no problems and she can't wash her hands. She's like, it's not working. It's not working. And it's something as simple as that can be a problem. So even just that product development and product research design, that's so important. And it affects so many different people in different ways. So thank you for that. And as far as Brad, your question about people I follow, I am horrific with names. So this is what I do for myself. My favorite platform is LinkedIn. So I'll go on LinkedIn and I follow those hashtags specifically. And the reason why is because then I find a lot of information and I get to interact and engage with people that might not be typically famous, but have a wealth of knowledge and some really great networking. So I follow diversity, inclusion, inclusivity. Let's see what else. I try to do DEI. So like I follow all of these hashtags just to see what is actually happening in the world. And it's really helpful because there are situations that you would have never thought about that you might even be doing, because that's the other thing with unconscious bias. Like we're all in this room and we have our own things, but there might be things that we're doing and we don't even realize it. And I'm like, oh my goodness, was I one of those people? Wow. But it's okay if we acknowledge it and then we try to do better, right?
Yeah, in terms of resources, I would say one great resource is Jennifer Brown. She's written a couple of books on DEI in the workplace, specifically LGBTQIA DEI. She's actually a friend of mine since college, so I know her well. I'll give her the shameless plug here. You can go to her website. I think it's called Jennifer Brown Consulting, maybe. And she does a tremendous amount of work on DEI within organizations like we're talking about today, not the recruiting aspect, but the culture, retention, how to build a really amazing workplace. And with regard to DEI in the specifically in the entertainment industry, if anybody's looking for more information or stats on that, USC's Annenberg School puts out a really well documented study every year about diversity in the entertainment business that has a lot of very helpful statistics and information on how we're doing in media and entertainment, which oftentimes is not well.
Yeah, great resources and great ideas. I will +1 for sure what Daphne said as far as LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn a lot for finding great resources as well as thought leaders, and looking at the content. There's such a high value of content on LinkedIn when it comes to the a business perspective, that I think it's so underutilized. People need to be using LinkedIn a lot more for that purpose. A few specific ones I will throw out there that I specifically follow regularly. Organization is Out Leadership. Is a great organization to follow across all their social, and they're very much focused on sort of the hierarchy and impact and statistics and data related to the impact that having not just queer leadership, but all diverse leadership, but with an emphasis on LGBTQ plus, from boards and C-level down, and then also how is that implemented across the different organizations within companies, which is a lot of what we talked about. And then there's a great podcast called the Color of Success podcast, which is very kind of specific, but it's related to destigmatizing mental health discussions among ethnic minorities as they advance their careers. So it's great to get that perspective and resources, and also sort of building a community of people, like-minded individuals. And then there is a great individual that I follow across multiple platforms, but LinkedIn. Madison Butler is a great DEI leader and advocate, and very outspoken. So just FYI, but as she should be. And then she's actually starting something called the Black Speakers Collection, or Collective. I think it's Collection, actually. So I highly recommend following her as well. There's so many resources out there, folks. And StartOut has tons of resources as well, obviously. So let's not forget about that. Let's go ahead and I think let's start to dive into some of these questions. We have some of these questions here, and I don't want to neglect them. And we only have about 20-ish minutes, so let's jump into it. I will throw these out to the group. I will say, don't feel the need for everyone to answer these. If you feel like you have something very specific to add, please do. But for time's sake, if you feel like somebody hit the nail on the head, then we'll move on to the next one. I will just start at the top and run down. One person says, how do you reconcile diversity by ethnic, sexual orientation, gender, etc., versus disadvantaged groups? For example, in Silicon Valley, many reports admit Asians in diversity reports as they are not perceived as disadvantaged here or in this specific industry. Yeah, I think that is very challenging. Does anybody have any thoughts on disadvantaged, marginalized groups versus sort of broader?
I will jump in and say, I think this comes back to the point we were discussing earlier, which is about the raw numbers as a metric versus culture and inclusion as a goal, right? Because regardless of the number of people who may be working at your company or in your industry from a particular group, there's still a need for an inclusive culture that takes into account differences among different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different sexual orientations. And I think just because you might be in a majority of a business or a company doesn't mean you don't still have DEI issues with regard to your own identity or your group's identity, right?
Yeah. Anybody else have anything to add? Or yeah, I mean, you know, the only thing I would say to that is I think it's going to vary from organization to organization and what their prioritization is at that moment, and even more so from team to team within that organization. Like I've worked at companies where from a recruiting perspective, perhaps one group was not so much prioritized because there was an abundance of those applicants and members of the team. But then from a marketing perspective and from a customer service perspective and a product design perspective, that group was included. So I think it may also vary a lot, and that may be the best answer. I mean, there's no really perfect answer that one fits all in this situation, I don't think. So let's move on to the next question. Let's see. Please answer all our policies. What specific policies would you expect? Oh, what specific policies? This person works at a large organization with offices across the globe. They specifically asked about policies that are LGBTQ specific, I guess, and then the response I got back was that everything applies to everybody essentially. And so are there certain LGBTQ plus policies you think that might be different and might need to be included versus like sort of the collective diversity policies? Anyone have any thoughts on that? One thing I would say is, I mean, I think specifically one area I can think of when it comes to trans individuals, I think you can't really necessarily lump all of their specific needs in with everybody else's. I mean, I think it's important to be included in like healthcare and all that kind of thing. Make sure that, you know, surgery and hormones and therapy and all those kind of things are all included in insurance packages for sure. But then I think there may be other things that need to be considered as far as like name changing. You know, name changes across most companies are set up for when people are married or when they're divorced. So is there a policy in place at your company that someone can just change their name because they've changed their name and that's the name they no longer go by? And then another thing I would consider is, does your company have a policy related to pronouns? Like, I mean, I'm not sure we should necessarily require everyone to use a pronoun, but is there a way to encourage it? And like, is there a sample template for including pronouns in even like email signatures and things like that, you know? So or in PowerPoint or slide decks or things like that, is that part of the template to include pronouns? So I think there are a few things I think that are related to gender identity and trans persons that we might need to consider that are separate. And I'm sure there are other queer things as well, but those are the ones that stand out off the top of my head. Anyone else have anything to add to that? No. Cool. Let's see. I'm going to jump to what are examples of some of maybe your individual or your company's DEI goals? Like, can you name just one that either you personally are trying to adopt that's DEI related, or maybe your company, you've worked with something on your company?
In the past, I've worked with some companies there were two that stand out. One was because I worked for an educational organization. So they were very focused on making sure that they update the exams to not have bias, which was a huge task. And I still think, and it's been years since I've worked with them, that they are still working on this. And I think that that's something that it's going to evolve as society changes. So will updating these exams. So there was that. And then the other organization that I worked with had some really great ERG programs, and that's how they developed that. And I think that that was a great initiative that they had. It was a little bit difficult because I think I even saw a comment. It's like, you're never going to be able to fulfill everyone in the organization's needs. So you have to balance that out and weigh that out. Is that an initiative we can take on? And if it is it a pilot? Who are we going to address first? How are we going to address it? Things like that. So it can be a little difficult. I think it's kind of like that question you just answered, Brad. Like, I think this could be something for an LGBTQ, like, I'm not sure, maybe a trans might need this, but maybe there's some other issues. So I think it's more than just this simple, what is the strategy? What are you going to work on? It's looking at the organization holistically.
Great points. Anybody have anything to add as far as personal goals or examples you can share as what you worked on?
Yeah, I could give a quick example. So at Marmoset, since we are a music company, one of our like organizational DEI goals is to highlight more underrepresented artists and really make sure that they are getting as many listens and downloads as any other artists. And so that particular goal on the technical side has involved like our engineering team building a new feature in the website that essentially highlights those underrepresented artists.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the kind of detail that companies might not think of if they didn't have diverse teams working on those. Okay, let's H, do you have something to add? I don't want to cut you off, or were you good?
No, I was going to say, like, our whole mission at Hustle Up is to try and democratize and diversify access to the media and entertainment business. So we spend a lot of time thinking about this on many, many, many fronts. But part of it is, I think, building community. I think that's part of it too. What we're trying to build in terms of our users and our members is a diverse community that's searchable. And I think similarly, in terms of thinking about how we're building a team and a company, we want to really embrace a community approach to what we're doing.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and so your goal was start your company. That was your goal, which is great. So it takes leaders like all of you to sort of step out and say, you know what, I'm going to make sure this is inclusive across the board. And so keep doing what you're doing, all of you. Let's see. What about specific examples of maybe how you may have created opportunities for authentic stories at your organization, whether this could be perhaps internally or externally, authentic stories? And I'm going to slightly alter the question to say authentic stories and or discussions, maybe through a nonprofit you work with or a company you worked with or things like that. Any thoughts on that from anyone? I can start really quick. Is one example I can give is that I know when I was working at a company, we were really trying to amplify stories of marginalized groups specifically. And so we would look for, we worked, I'll just say, I worked on a group within Facebook groups at Facebook. And so we specifically were looking for groups that were grassroots, mostly grassroots. We sometimes also amplified nonprofits and things like that, but mostly grassroots. And we would try to find those that had wasn't necessarily the largest membership of groups. It was more like the highest level of engagement. And so they were posting regularly. They were getting a lot of comments and discussions happening and things like that. And so we would then do blog stories and features on them and just really try to like give them a platform and a stage to just drive more toward their already existing community that they were great at building, and just wanted to basically continue to support what they're doing and champion them as much as possible. So I think that's one way. So often, sometimes it's looking externally and looking at the community that exists. That's sort of my one recommendation, and trying to find that community. That might be the challenging part, is sometimes locating it and how to sort of find who to focus on, but come up with some way of finding that community and then figuring out a way or multiple ways to amplify that community and give them a platform. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would amplify the community outreach aspect of it. I know with Out in Tech, we have been trying our best to amplify KT BIPOC voices, not just within the KT BIPOC committee, but with events across the entire organization. And so that involves outreach to potential folks to speak at events, as well as just within our leadership team as well. And yeah, I think that outreach is a big aspect of that.
Awesome. Okay, we still have several questions, so let's keep working through them. I'm so excited. This audience is very engaged, so please keep posting questions. We will get to as many as we can in the time allotted. We probably have time for maybe a couple more before we have to do our wrap up, maybe 3 more. Any recommendations on I'm assuming they're talking about internal companies mentoring as a way of promoting DEI, to help promote DEI priorities and culture. Do you have any thoughts? Does anybody have any experience with that, first of all, which we may not, which is fair. And then if so, maybe what have you seen that works or does not work when it comes to mentoring and DEI?
I was part of a mentoring group at a large media company that I was a head of department at, and we launched a mentoring group for women, specifically for people identified as women or female who were assistants and sort of entry-level roles, to be paired with executives, VP and above, to sort of do career development. And one of the reasons we structured it the way we did was that we wanted to make sure that there were no issues with direct reporting in the mentor relationship. So I think it's really important when you think about how to set up the infrastructure of any kind of mentoring program, that the person who is the mentee has the ability to be really open and honest about what they're struggling with, what their issues are, any sense of a toxic culture that they're experiencing. And that's very challenging to do if their mentor is a direct report, or even within the same immediate dotted line or threaded org. So I think, while it might make sense, oh, well, this person is in whatever it is, content development, so we'll give them a mentor that's in content development. That can be a problematic approach to mentoring programs, just because you kind of want one step removed for somebody to really feel like it's a safe space to explore the issues they're having. That would be my only sort of caveat.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It really depends on what the purpose of the mentoring is to that individual, as well as, I think if you're at a company, well, I think that's the difference of looking at it from a company versus an organization. Company may have other variables involved too, like mentoring as a path to career leadership or whatever, but still you should be thinking about that individual and their needs and what's a good match or fit for them as well. I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions here for sake of time, because they're both measurement and metric related. One person asked about we'll just say, what are maybe the three? One of them sort of asked about budgeting and how to measure and metrics and measuring metrics of success. And then someone else just asked about what are three metrics perhaps to measure effectiveness of a DEI program at a company or an org. So let's just sort of say that general question, what are the three metrics needed, or what are suggestions on, doesn't have to be three. If we each can give one idea perhaps on a metric that could be measured for success. I will preface this, and I'm sure everyone probably will say this if I don't say it anyways, is I think every organization and company is going to be different and every situation is going to be different. However, let's give like some best suggestions or ideas. We can each give like one thought. I'll throw it to Daphne first, and then each of you can add something, and then if needed, I'll add something at the end.
The first thing that I thought about, of course, was because I have my marketing hat on, is looking at the metric of what I produce for the organization, how does that showcase our own diversity and inclusion, right? But it makes me, I get stuck on this, right? Because as a marketer, I also don't believe that an image that you throw out someplace means that your company is fulfilling a specific goal. So we have to be really mindful of that. I think if we think about how we started this conversation and looking at DEI as an overall company objective, and every department is looking at how they can support that initiative, then for marketing purposes, that's what I may look at. But I think it cannot only be just me looking at this marketing perspective and what I think is a good metric for success.
Great point. Abel H, do you want to add a thought on a metric?
I mean, I think a lot of companies look at metrics like churn, and they look at, promotion rates, and they look at, recruitment rates and things like that. But I think one of the things I think we keep coming back to on this call is, are there ways to be more holistic in the way we're evaluating culture and evaluating employee satisfaction? I think, people will obviously vote with their feet. If they want to leave, they'll churn, but we're in the great resignation now. But I think, ideally you want metrics that are telling you about your culture way before that happens, right? When you get a number that says all your diverse employees are leaving, it's a little late. So, I think, just kind of globally, I would say we all need to figure out ways to be assessing employee satisfaction every day, really.
Yeah, +1 to the, once massive groups of marginalized groups are leaving your company, it's kind of too late. I'm not saying efforts should not be made, but you are way behind on your efforts at that point if that's happening. Abel, do you have any other thoughts on metrics or method of measurements for success related to DEI at companies regardless of size?
Nothing to add. I would just echo everything that's been said.
Yeah, I would sort of slightly add on to what H said as far as thinking about it so much earlier and also and holistically. And I think it's not that there's necessarily separate, there may be some metrics that are separate for DEI, but I think a lot of the thought process, if you're holistic about your DEI, should factor into your other measurements of success. So like, for example, having comprehensive product testing groups that are representative of various different audiences. Well, did you get feedback from them? What was the feedback? So maybe it's a matter of being thoughtful throughout the process and how you measure it. So you have the ability to sort data and look at it in those different audience subsets. So it doesn't just get merged in with the whole. So that's it. And that's not necessarily a metric per se. That's more of just a operations or how you manage your programs across all your different teams within your company. But I think thinking about having a way to separate out the data so you can see, well, wait, is this one subset giving us a very unsatisfactory result versus when you lump them in with the rest is that come very homogeneous and they get sort of lost in the shuffle. So maybe thinking about the process and being able to separate them out. That's just one thing I would add as sort of a metric of sorts. And then somebody did ask, and I don't have an answer to this, and I don't know that anyone else here does because we're not necessarily coming from a legal background, but maybe someone has experienced this. Someone said in the chat something about getting pushback from even collecting LGBTQ plus information. I'm assuming they're probably partly talking from like a recruiting perspective, but even just internally, like because there's concern about people self-identifying or whatever. Do y'all have any thoughts on that, or have you encountered that specifically in any of your organizations or companies?
I recently changed jobs, and I've actually started seeing some of those surveys on the job applications now. It didn't bother me, but I don't know if it would bother others, to me. And it was like a running list where I clearly can tell that it was a big initiative for their organization because they were listing the questions. But it's almost like it became commonplace because I had a lot of organizations doing that. But at the same token, one of the pluses was I also had a lot of organizations that had, what are your pronouns? And I was like, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So I think it's also what is important to you, because I was like, oh, thank you so much. And it was like, there was even one that said something like, how do you pronounce your name, like phonetically? I was like, oh, this is even better. Let's go. I think there are companies that are trying. I've seen it. I don't know if it's a bad thing, a good thing. For me, I was appreciative of it because I was like, holy cow, maybe this organization values diversity. I don't know.
Yeah, great point. I think making it optional maybe is the key. So it's as it becomes more normal, more customary across companies, I think maybe there'll be less pushback, hopefully. But I think, it has to be an optional thing. That's the key. And then people who are uncomfortable with it, they don't have to self-identify, but those that wish to can. And I think as long as it's presented as it's a value add from the company's perspective, then more people will want to self-identify. We are almost at time. So I do want to say a big thank you to our panelists again. H, thank you so much. Abel, and thank you so much, Daphne. And of course, a big thank you to, again, our sponsor for this specific event, which was Comcast NBCUniversal, and powered by, LIFT Labs, powered by Techstars. I was thrown for a second there because I'm doing them out of order here, but I'll just repeat it myself again, which is fine. The more we mention our sponsor, the better. There are some upcoming events, so hopefully you enjoy this event and you can sign up for our next 3 virtual online events that StartOut is hosting, February 2nd, 3rd, and I can't see that time, 4th, 22nd, 2nd, 3rd, and 22nd. And then again, thank you to the panelists. Thank you for all of you attending. And again, a big shout out, thank you to Comcast NBCUniversal LIFT Labs presented by Techstars. They do, if you're interested, their applications open March 1st. So as you can see here, you can go to Comcast NBCUlift.com to learn more, but apply if you're interested in that accelerator program. And thanks again. And please, we hope to see you at the next StartOut event. And thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.